Katie. We have The Clue of the Broken Locket. We are on chapter 20, last chapter. A rewarding hunch. When Raskin, Carl, and Jake dragged the girls away, Mrs. Driscoll grabbed the twins by the hand and pulled them out the front door. As they stepped onto the porch, Bess and George ran up. The woman attempted to brush by them, but George caught hold of Kathy. Kevin pulled loose and ran to Beth. At that moment, Ned and Bert dashed up the steps.
"Where are Nancy and Cecily?" Ned asked.
Bess and George turned questioningly to Mrs. Driscoll. The woman's lips tightened firmly, and she glared at the young people.
"The bad men took the pretty ladies to the cellar," Kevin sobbed.
"The door's in the kitchen," George called as Ned and Bert raced into the house. They dashed down to the cellar and ran along the passageway. It only took a minute for them to break down the door at the end. "Ned! Bert!" Nancy and Cecily exclaimed when the boys burst into the beach house.
"Oh, Ned," Nancy cried. "I've never been so glad to see you."
Quickly, she introduced the boys to Susan and told them the high points of her story. As soon as the ropes had been removed from the girls, Susan ran to the door.
"I must get my babies," she declared.
By the time the 5 young people reached the front hall, they found Dave, Chief Stovall, and 2 policemen there. With them, handcuffed together, were Carl Driscoll, Neil Raskin, and the man called Jake. Bess had the twins by the hand, while George firmly held Mrs. Driscoll's arm.
"We found these men trying to escape in a boat," Chief Stovall told Nancy, "but they refuse to talk. Perhaps you can help us."
Susan ran up to the children and put her arms around them. Before she could speak, the little girl said,
"Are you Mommy?"
"Yes, darling," Susan said gently. "Come into the living room with me and I'll tell you all about it." The little boy and girl smiled happily.
"I'm glad," Kathy said shyly. "You're nice."
Bess and George were amazed by this revelation and overjoyed at the happy reunion. When Susan and the twins had left, Nancy told Chief Stovall a conversation she and Cecily had overheard in the beach house.
"I'm sure you'll find a load of counterfeit records in the truck outside." "Good for you, Miss Drew," the chief said. "You're an excellent detective, and I apologize for not taking your reports more seriously. Now tell me about these children."
Nancy repeated Susan's story. "I don't know how the Driscolls got the children," she admitted, "but I suspect it was done illegally."
"Well, Driscoll, would you like to tell us, or shall we book you on a kidnapping charge?" the chief said sternly.
Mrs. Driscoll spoke up.
"Tell him, Carl. We didn't know the twins had a mother living. It was all a terrible mistake."
She sank into a chair and hid her face in her hands. All the fight seemed to have gone out of Carl Driscoll. He explained that he and his wife had discovered the children at the edge of a campsite one morning over a year before. There was no one else around, and they decided the twins had been abandoned.
"We'd been talking about using some children in an acrobatic act my brother and Vince and I had," he went on. "So we decided to train these youngsters. Just sort of informally adopted them. The act didn't work out very well, though, and a few months ago we decided to see if we could find the children's family and maybe collect a reward. The name Pudding Stone Lodge was burned into the top of a little trunk we found with the kids. I made some inquiries and learned of such a place on Misty Lake, so we came here. It was empty, but it looked like a good place for another project of ours, so I rented it. We were getting along okay until these busybody girls moved into that cottage."
"But what happened to the Talbots' car and all their luggage?" Nancy asked.
"We had to have money to take care of the kids," Carl replied sullenly. "We sold the car and the rest of the stuff." "Driscoll," the chief said sternly, "you could not possibly have believed those children were abandoned with the car and luggage there. There's plenty you'll have to clear up for us. You come along now and join your pals in jail."
The policeman led the 4 prisoners away.
"I want to thank you, young ladies, for helping rid Misty Lake of these disreputable characters," the chief said, "and solving the mystery of the Phantom Launch. Please say good night to Mrs. Talbot for me, and tell her I'm delighted she has found her children."
A few minutes later, Susan came into the room, a happy smile on her face. "The twins are in bed," she announced. "They've really taken all this excitement very well." "Do sit down, Susan," Nancy urged, "and clear up a few more puzzles for us. Did you try to signal from the bullseye window? Oh, did you see me? My hands were tied and I was gagged, but I managed to get a hold of a small mirror and move it in the sunlight. But Mrs. Driscoll caught me and took the glass away. Susan continued. They untied me and removed the gag when they brought me food, but one of them always stayed to guard me. One evening, Vince was called away and I was left alone for a few minutes. He had taken a lamp, but I still had my handbag and got a flashlight from it. I signaled from the window, then, with my nail file, managed to push the key out of the lock and pull it onto the door with my fork. I escaped and ran into the woods, but they caught me again. That's the night I saw you and called to you, Nancy put in. But we know now you were too frightened to trust anybody. Susan nodded, shivering a little. Then she brightened and turned to Cecily. But I haven't forgotten you have the other half of my locket, and we're cousins. My father told me the story of the Delaroy brothers, our great-great-grandfathers, and how Simon's share of the family fortune was found in the beach house after the war. But Dad never knew what happened to William. Enthusiastic, Susan suggested that all the girls stay at the lodge and search for Cecily's treasure. They agreed. Ned stood up.
I think we fellows had better go. If you girls are going to stay here, perhaps we can sleep at the cottage.
Of course, said Cecily, and Nancy added, Come back early in the morning. We'll all have breakfast together and then hunt for the treasures. Bess and George went with the boys, and soon returned with overnight things for the 4 girls. It seemed they had just fallen asleep when they were awakened by a pounding on the front door. It was morning. They scrambled into their clothes and ran downstairs. There were Ned, Bert, and Dave, and Nico was with them.
I wanted to find out what was going on here, so I drove down after my performance last night, he explained.
The girls welcomed him eagerly. We'll have breakfast ready in a jiffy, Bess promised.
I'm interested in Carl Driscoll's phantom launch, Ned remarked. While you girls are rustling up the food, we fellows will go down to the beach house and take a look at his equipment.
When the boys returned half an hour later, an appetizing meal of melon, bacon and eggs, toast, and milk was ready. Did you find out exactly how Carl made the phantom launch appear? Nancy asked.
Yes, it is an ingenious arrangement of wires, sound projector, and a film clip. The picture was projected through the hole in the door onto the mist, which gave it that eerie appearance. No wonder he had everyone around here scared silly.
All but Nancy, Bess reminded him proudly. None of you really believed it was real, Nancy insisted. Then she said, I vote we look right now for Cecily's treasure. It must be hidden around here someplace.
Where shall we start?
George asked briskly. Nancy replied that she'd been mulling over the location of the cupboard mentioned in Simon's note. She'd come to the conclusion that the present dining room could have been the old kitchen because it had the large fireplace. When Simon wrote that he had hidden the treasure in the kitchen cupboard, it sounded too easy. The cupboard must have been camouflaged in some way, so I think we should investigate that niche where the vase stands.
Lead on, Detective Drew, Ned urged. What shall we tear down first?
Nancy smiled and turned to Susan. Would you mind if we take out the paneling below the shelf? Go ahead, Susan replied. I can't wait to see if the treasure is there. The boys got tools from the cellar and carefully removed the wood panels from the wall beneath the niche. Rough plaster was revealed. Nancy knelt and examined it. I'm sure there's more wood under this plaster, she said. Let's take it off. Under her direction, Ned and Nico chipped off the plaster.
There's a door here,
Nico called excitedly. The young people gathered around breathlessly while Nico pried open the door. The space beyond was filled with packages.
There's your family treasure, Cecily,
Nico said, straightening up and putting an arm around his fiancée. Oh, I can't believe it, she exclaimed. Ned and Bert dragged the bundles out and helped Cecily open them. There was one box filled with gold coins, a package of old securities, and piece after piece of beautiful silver. I wonder if the securities are worth anything now, Cecily remarked when she had spread everything out on the dining room table.
Ned whistled. Even if they're not, you have a fortune there in gold.
Susan threw her arms around Cecily and said, Oh, I'm so glad to have your part of the family treasure. Now Nico and I can get married, Cecily beamed. And it's all due to you, Nancy. You trapped the record pirates and found the fortune. And helped me get back Kathy and Kevin, Susan said. I had a lot of assistance from Bess and George and the boys, Nancy said modestly.
I have an idea, Nico spoke up. Cecily, why don't you and Susan combine your family resources? You can use some of your money to develop your property as a summer resort. You can build a dance pavilion out on the old picnic grounds, and the Flying Dutchman will provide the music.
That's wonderful, Nico, Susan agreed, and we'll restore the garden and install the Iron Flamingo in its old location. While the others were planning excitedly, Nancy was wondering wistfully when another mystery would come her way. She was to find out soon upon discovering the message in the hollow oak. Cecily, meanwhile, had slipped from the room. She returned with the locket and whispered to Susan. When the girl smiled and nodded, Cecily raised her hand for silence. Listen, everybody, she said. Susan and I want Nancy to have a memento of this adventure. We're going to have the locket repaired and hope she will wear it and think of the cousins she has united through her detective work. Hear, hear! Bess, George, and the boys cheered and applauded. Nancy smiled, though her eyes were filled with happy tears. Thank you both. I'll never, never forget you or the clue of the broken locket. And there we go. That is the end of the book. I hope you enjoyed. I enjoyed reading it to you. And I'll see you again soon with the next one. Love you.